All right, so let's move away from the index page and onto the create page. At the very top, you can see that we have said that this is a strongly typed view, and that when we deal with data inside this view, we're dealing with an instance of the to-do model that we created. As we look at the very top here, there is a form being defined that we'll see a number of form elements inside of that form. This is just a regular HTML form, but we're using tag helpers to define the action. So when you post this form, post it to the action called create inside of our controller, okay? And we'll take a look at what that generates in just a moment here, but that's a use of tag helpers instead of one of the Razor syntax helpers, which you might have been familiar with if you used version 5, ASP.NET MVC 5. Okay, moving on beyond that and some of the formatting that goes on with Bootstrap. Here's basically 3 parts to this. Actually 4 parts. No, 3 parts. Okay. 4 parts. All right, so there's this validation summary. Any errors that happen, we'll see them in a list at the top. All right, we'll change that at some point in an upcoming mini course, but that is what that is for. Next, we see a series of these form groups, form group as defined inside of Bootstrap. So we have a label and an input and then a span, and that span will be a validation message related to that input. What kind of validation message? Well, we don't really have any validation just yet, but we're going to define that in just a moment. You can see that this label here again, it's ASP4, so that's a tag helper for description. Description we know is a property of the model. So this tag helper doesn't deal so much with routes and URLs, but it deals with creating form elements for a particular model property. In this case, the description property. Notice that same thing you see here in the input. We're going to create an input for the description property of our model, and an ASP validation for the description property of our model. Same thing is true with our checkbox. Here we have a label for ASP4 completed, so the completed property of our model to do, and an input ASP4 completed. Now, what kind of input will be created here? We know it's a checkbox. Well, that's the magic of this tag helper. It knows the data type and will create the appropriate properties of the input HTML element based on what a completed is. So it'll set the type equal to checked. Okay, and then finally we get a button here at the bottom. There's really nothing all that special about it. Okay, so at this point we can create an empty to do, I believe, because there's nothing stopping us from doing it. Obviously that would be a bad idea, so we'll want to change up our model and add some attributes to say you can't do that. So here we'll start with the create, like so, and I'm just going to hit the create button, and well, it created an empty, an empty to do, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. We hit details, there's no description. Doesn't make any sense to do that, right? So at a minimum, we need to modify our application so that it requires that we enter something in the description field. So let's begin by going to our model. So here's the simple class we created, and in the description, I want to add an attribute called required. Now, when I type that, I don't get IntelliSense help. It looks at me like this is crazy talk. There's nothing called required. That's because we need to add the proper namespace and a using at the top of this file. You see a little light bulb off to the side. Gives you some quick actions. Oh, did you want to add this namespace? System.componentModel.annotate data annotations? Absolutely. And so now when we do that, you can see that the word required lights up. And what we've done is add a data annotation to our model that says when somebody creates a new or edits or does anything with model, the description has to be there. It cannot be blank. So let's run the application again, doing nothing different whatsoever, just made that one tiny change, and let's see what happens. Let's go back to create a new to-do. Here I'm going to just go ahead and try to click create, and I'm going to get this, that span tag lights up, it pops up. The description field is required. Where did that text come from? That's just standard text. You can change it, but it's the default text for the English, since I'm running from an English US EN, I think is the locale. That's the default text that will be displayed to the end user. Let's change that. Required, I think IntelliSense can help me out here because I didn't prepare this. Maybe if I do that, yeah. So now, by opening up a parenthesis next to the word required, I can give it one of several different optional elements here, like error message equal, and it's like, you can't create an empty to-do item, and we'll even get a little sassy, dummy, because that's just how I like my applications. A little bit sassy. All right, there we go. Had to close that opened parenthesis. And now let's run the application again. And we'll override that default error message text that pops up for that scenario. All right, perfect. All right, so you can see that we've taken a fairly simple tact. Maybe we want to do something a little bit different, like I talked about earlier when I said, you know, we can change the display name. Can't I set the name here? Yeah, let's set name equals, and then we'll set this to call the to-do item. All right. So I don't want to save it in the database as to-do item, and I don't want it displayed to the user as to-do item with no spaces. I want this to be friendly and visible so that when I run the application, everywhere in my application where it refers to the description, I've now changed the name in one fell swoop to description, or to whatever it was, to-do item. So when I go to the create, notice, there's no description there anymore. It's just to-do item. When I go back to the list, it's not called description anymore. It's called to-do item. Perfect. All right, so you can see that with data annotations, we can do a couple of things. We can change how a given property of our model is rendered throughout the entire application. Furthermore, we can change and add constraints to our model so that you cannot add data to our database, to our model that is invalid, that doesn't make sense in our application. You can do other things like, I think we can set, there's range required, data type, I think we can set that. And we'll cover these in an entire micro course on data annotations and things of that nature. And some things we may want to do or may want to avoid. The purists out there might look at this and say, well, that's all well and good, but now you've taken a very pure thing, a domain class, and you have leaked the abstraction of ASP.NET MVC so that you couldn't take this class out and use it somewhere else. It has to be used now in an ASP.NET MVC Core application, and they would probably say that's a bad idea, and I understand, but there are some ways we can get around that too, and they're pretty creative. So that is model binding, and we'll just continue on from there and continue to walk through this example until I feel like we've completely fleshed out all the major components and how they relate together inside of ASP.NET. I think we'll talk about configuration next time. So we'll see you there. Thanks.